Looking at specific types of backups and virtual machines specifically, we want to take a look at the ways that we can recover the workloads as well as the operating systems. My name is Bob Tickleman. I'm excited to be your guide for this introduction to virtual machine backups inside of Azure. When you take a look at a traditional virtual machine, there's several ways in which you can store, capture, and recover the information that's available to the virtual machine. In previous modules, we covered that a virtual machine and its data stores in a durable format is stored in a thing called a VHD. So it's a file-based system. And what we can then do is, from a file-based system, take some ways to back up that information, in addition to the capability of the virtual machine having this feature called a snapshot, which is a moment in time capture of that disk state so that we can recover back to that moment in time without having to go through the reading of the data state at that moment in time and writing it to a file. Now, a lot of this is predicated on a technology called VSS, or the volume shadow copy services that we have with inside of Windows and have for many years. Gone are the days where you had to literally read data files at that moment in time, and if they were locked, you couldn't capture them because they were locked because they were in use. Volume shadow services as a way to take a moment in time capture of all that information, and then we back up from that copy of that information and then get rid of it. So it's a way to take that moment in time capture and make it available for a consistent backup. We're going to take a look at the ways to protect your workloads from a virtual machine perspective using these different services available to you. As I was describing, there's several ways in which we can capture virtual machines specifically through a variety of services. Built into the virtual machine capabilities has been the long-standing capability to snapshot the virtual machine. That moment in time capture. Now, this is a file or file consistent backup. All of the state of the virtual machine may not be captured, and that's where you're going to take a look at that second one, the Azure Backup, which provides an application consistent backup. In the case of uncompleted writes, it's going to be able to capture that information. That snapshot would be like if you just pulled the power cord out of something, it's going to only be able to capture the data as it existed at that moment in time. Anything that was in memory or resident or volatile would be lost. The Azure Backup will provide for a consistent app level recovery of that information. And on the far right hand side, you then get the Azure Site Recovery Services. Now, not really meant as a backup, it was really for a business disaster recovery capability. We now have the capability of replicating the not just data, but the infrastructure to run the data into the cloud. And we can replicate some or all of it. And then what we do is do a delta difference replication. So at specific moments in time, it could be every 5 seconds, every 5 minutes, however long you want that delta difference to be, and what is your business willing to live with, you can now have that delta difference replication do a bit level replication of that information that has changed since the last replication back to the ASR site that you're working with. So those are some of the options that are available to you. When you take a look at the virtual machine snapshots, as we described, the built-in snapshot capabilities allows for, whether it's Hyper-V or VMware, to take a snapshot of that moment in time and then have a copy of that then could be used to then back up into your backup vaults that you're working with. So you're not actually having to run backups on the virtual machines. They can be done from the snapshots. When you take a look at the RSV, or the Recovery Services Vault, and its backup options, we have the different type of workloads. There's Azure workloads that integrate specifically with Azure services, and then we have those on-premises workloads, and they can be done one of several ways. I mentioned that you can have a backup agent, that if you had a virtual machine or a server, physical server, you could put the agent on that virtual machine or server. At the agent policy would then take the information and take it and back it up directly into the vault. Now, if it's on premises, you're going to have to use up your network bandwidth out through your gateway, through whatever the connection is to Azure, to copy that information. If you're using the backup server capability, the agent still now has that capability, but it copies it to the local server and it aggregates that information and stores it locally for a period of time, potentially, and then uses that cached copy at the server to then back it up into the vault. So it's still going to be in a recovery vault inside of Azure. So the process to do this is you create the recovery services vault. I showed this in another recording where we showed the difference between a backup vault and a recovery services vault. And you then pick the workload that you want. You use the portal to define the type of backup that you're working. And then you use whether it be the agent or the server to then back up that virtual machine to the location of your choice. The restoration of the virtual machine is very similar to, but opposite of the backup processes. Depending on the type of backup that you used, as well as the device that you're working with, whether it's going through the backup server or the agent, you would then use a following process to be able to recover it. I think I mentioned before that the backup agent allows you to back up and recover an operating system from the OS. If you're using the backup server, you had the capability to do what's called a bare metal recovery, so you don't even have to install an operating system to then recover that services too. So let's go take a look at the backing up of a virtual machine. So when we take a look at the backup options from a virtual machine, I'm going to go into the blade for the virtual machine. I'm going to look at the backup and disaster recovery options, and you can see I've got the 3 different options available to us here. There is just a traditional backup, and this is going to need the backup recovery services vault, the RSV. And so I can either create one or use one that's already created. And you saw I had created one previously. There's my AZ-104 demo. What kind of policy do I want to have? It's an enhanced policy or selected that's going to control the range and the dates that I'm working with and the type of infrastructure that it's going to use. Here's my frequency. And which disk do I want to back up? I only have one disk in the virtual machine, and I can enable the backup. So that is just going to back up the application information in a traditional backup of the disk for the operating system. In a disaster recovery, this gets into ASR, the Azure Site Recovery. I'm not going to go through this process. It's not really part of the class, but I can now replicate, as I said, an infrastructure out to another region that I'm working with. And then we have those restore points. These are those snapshots, those moment in times that we're working with. I've already got one created, but I just want to show you how easy it is. Selecting the restore point name, I'll call it number 2. What is the restore point collection I want to work with? I've got that collection, the region I'm dealing with. And we talked about in the lecture the difference between app consistent and crash consistent. The easiest way to describe this crash consistent would be thinking of whatever's running on that machine. If you would just pull the power cord out, whatever's already written to the disk is what's going to be captured. All that in-memory resident stuff, it's gone. The app consistent will make sure that the pending writes have completed so that we get an app consistent recovery we're dealing with. But just selecting these features, it's pretty straightforward. Which disk do you want to select if there's multiple disks? And then review and create. Now, it takes a few minutes to do that. I've already got one that I built I can go take a look at. And it gives me the information from that disk that I could then use to restore the information from. So there's an example of using the 3 different options for recovery or backup of a virtual machine. Let's return to our lecture. So before we get into the close, we want to take a look at the ASR, the Azure Site Recovery. And here's a view of what that might look like. So whether it be from region to region, on premises to a region, are ways for us to provide that site recovery capability. And what you're seeing is you have an infrastructure that you've built for deployment. So this is maybe your prod environment. You've got your VMs at its different network levels. You've got your disk requirements for the disks itself. You've got your databases. And what you end up doing is creating that replica of that environment. Now, what it can do is, for the vast majority of information, you don't need to replicate. The operating system's the operating system, unless it's being patched. But what you're able to do now is to be able to identify the delta difference between the replica at a point in time and where it exists. And so you're only replicating through here based on a time interval that says every, as I said, 5 minutes, 5 seconds, depending on how consistent you wanted the data in the ASR site to be to the data from the production site that you're working with. But that's basically a look at ASR. and you can have these machines turned off. The replica data is being updated so that if failover, because we've got a monitoring agent that watches for this, if this site were to fail, it triggers the powering on of all these resources, attaching to that current set of data, and then taking over the traffic, because now what was being routed to the region gets rerouted to the ASR site. We've seen that there's a variety of ways to provide backup and recovery as well as site recovery capabilities with virtual machines. As a traditional workload, we have ways to get the information from that virtual machine, whether it be from snapshots, whether it be from running traditional backups in either an app consistent or crash consistent manner, as well as being able to replicate the actual infrastructure and then the operating data to an Azure site. So all of these are options for you to find which one, or maybe combinations of them, is going to meet your business continuity and disaster recovery needs. Thanks for joining us for this session. To continue your learning, watch other videos in the course or explore more on Microsoft Learn at aka.ms/learn.